Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Annual Digital Islamic Studies Curriculum Distinguished Lecture. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether you are here with us in person or joining us virtually. My name is Pauline Jones, and I am a professor of political science here at the University of Michigan and the director of the Digital Islamic Studies Curriculum, which we refer to most often as DISC. DISC has been generously funded by the Mellon Foundation since 2014 and is a member of the International Institute at the University of Michigan. Our core mission is to develop a collaborative program of instruction in global Islamic studies across the institutions of the Big Ten Academic Alliance in order to provide students with a truly global perspective on Islam and the Muslim world. Each year, DISC invites a prominent member of the Muslim community to give its distinguished lecture. Past speakers include Islamic studies scholar Dr. Syed Hossein Nasr, the interfaith leader Ibu Patel, Iranian activist and Nobel Peace Prize winner Shirin Ebadi, politician and public health expert Abdul El-Said, and the Egyptian writer, producer, surgeon, doctor, media critic, and television host Bassem Youssef. The DISC Annual Distinguished Lecture Series supplements our goal of providing students and the broader community, the broader intellectual community at our partner institutions, with a variety of perspectives on the Islamic world. Before introducing this year's distinguished lecturer, I want to thank all of those who helped make this event possible. First and foremost, I want to thank our new program coordinator for DISC, Nur Shana Ayers. She took on the job and just a few days later started to organize this event for us. So she's only been with us for a few weeks, but we're already finding her very invaluable, so thank you. I also want to thank our team at the Global Islamic Studies Center, Natasha Gruden-Alibegovich, Hannah Matter, and Raquel Buckley. And of course, all of our co-sponsors, the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, the Program International and Comparative Studies, and the Donia Human Rights Center. Without further delay, let me introduce our 7th Annual DISC Distinguished Lecturer, Jawad Sukhanyar. Jawad Sukhanyar is a seasoned and intrepid journalist. Previously, he worked for major news agencies in Afghanistan, where he reported for the New York Times for 8 years. He also worked freelance, writing analytical pieces for various international news outlets, including the Eurasia Review. In early 2020, he served as a media advisor in the office of the first vice president of Afghanistan. Jawad came to the University of Michigan in September 2018 as a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow, studying issues related to women's rights in Afghanistan. With the support of Wallace House, he and his family returned to Ann Arbor last October after fleeing the Taliban. Jawad is now a journalist in residence with the Donia Human Rights Center and the International Institute. His project, Post-U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, Afghan Peace Process, and the Fate of Press Freedom, will examine why the U.S. mission in Afghanistan ended in chaos and humiliation, what could have been done differently, and how the Afghan peace process was derailed after the Taliban took the country and formed an interim government. Next fall, I'm delighted to announce that Jawad will join the Department of Communications here at the University of Michigan as the Marsh Visiting Professor. The consequences of the U.S. departure have been dire, resulting in the mass starvation of millions of Afghans inside the country and the denial of their basic rights and freedoms. Jawad has graciously agreed to share his experience and his perspective with us tonight in his talk, Afghanistan's Bleak Future Under Taliban Rule. For this, we are both honored and grateful. Thank you so much, Jawad, for being here tonight and sharing with us your personal experience and your personal story. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, DISC. Thank you, University of Michigan. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today and talk about the topic that I've chosen. So let's get started. Afghanistan's bleak future under the Taliban rule. This is a cover page of one of my projects that I did back in 2011 when I was just graduating for my bachelor's degree from Goa University in India. And I chose this topic because I really wanted to know more about democracy itself. That's why we have this, I have this question mark here. So in order to do that, I just did a research and looked around and found out that Afghanistan had democracy in 3 instances in the past. The first time Afghanistan had democracy was in the 1920s. It was under a king who was a reformist. The king wanted to really change and democratize Afghanistan. The idea came to him when he had a long trip to Europe. He was traveling to Turkey, Italy, the UK, and a few other countries. And on his return, he just wanted to change. He was impressed by how he had seen democratic societies there. So, yeah, the first thing he did was that he allowed his wife to appear wearing a miniskirt and a hat in public, and then also ordered girls and boys schools to be together. And this is Afghanistan in the 1920s. It's a pretty conservative society. Religious leaders and these conservative people who were conservative sort of, rebelled against him and toppled him. He just couldn't do it. And then again, we had another king who tried to democratize Afghanistan and experience with democracy. This was in 1965, between 1965 and 73. So that's also known as Decade of Democracy in Afghanistan. King Zahir Shah allowed the parliament to take control of government, and he appointed a prime minister, and there was a parliament, a prime minister running the government, but he himself was still the king. Since he knew what had happened before him, he wanted to go slow. And that's why he made it for like at least 1 decade. And that was known as Decade of Democracy in Afghanistan. Again, his cousin from within the royal family revolted against him, and in a coup while the king was, when the king was out on an overseas trip, toppled him and declared Afghanistan a republic. So that's the second time. The third time was when the communists were ruling Afghanistan. This is in the 80s. It was a Soviet style of, government that they had, and they called themselves PDPA. That stands for People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And yeah, it ended when the civil war began and Mujahideen took over, and that was the end of it. So fast forward to 2001. I'm going to talk about this. 2001, the international community draws its attention on Afghanistan. Foreign forces come to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is like, again, trying to experience a new era, and the Afghans are really hopeful about their future. There is hope and about a new government that's more inclusive and democratic, and soon Afghanistan gets its first democratic constitution after passing behind the civil war. We get elections. This graffiti is from 2014. You see Afghan women in burqas, and you also see that it's about the presidential election. So we get elections, we get a democratic constitution where women can really exercise their rights. They can run for elections. They can also participate in the elections as voters. And yeah, so it's a more inclusive government. The minorities are included in the government, and yeah, so there is a window of opportunity that is there for Afghans, and Afghanistan also gets an independent human rights commission that's founded in 2002. This commission is in charge of promoting and protecting human rights of the people. It also works on rights of women, children, regards human rights abuses. The two major things that this commission wanted to do was to work on a transitional justice report as well as a war crime report. None of those really were finalized and done because of political reasons. They wanted to politicians who were still part of the Afghan government try to pressure them and avoid those reports to be released. But they really had a positive role in going along with democracy. So yeah, and for most of the time, this commission, which was independent of the Afghan government, was led by women, prominent Afghan women. And yeah, so media. Afghanistan had a freest media in the developing world, I should say, post 9/11, and that's mainly because there was democracy and freedom of speech was guaranteed in our constitution. We had a democratic constitution in Afghanistan, and as late as 2003, 2004, private TV channels, radio stations started, services, and that was really helping democracy, and the role that free media played in Afghanistan really strengthened democratic institutions, and also gave awareness to the public about elections, since it was a new phenomenon for Afghans after a long gap. It really helped women to know about their rights and to be able to come out in public and yeah, so exercise their rights, and entertainment programs were really prevalent and common in Afghanistan, and it was because of free media. And in that, international media also played a role in teaching and showing how Afghans could exercise their rights. I could say that the freedom of media in Afghanistan could be a role model in that region. I don't say it was excellent, but it was to that degree that some of our TV channels were even banned in the neighboring countries in Afghanistan because of how they, provided news and covered the stories. So I'm proud to be part of this family, and yeah, so we had the freest media, but it didn't really come without a cost. Afghanistan really lost some of its greatest journalists, and it was, I should say, according to some of the reports, between 62 to 64 journalists, both international and national journalists, were killed in the past 20 years in Afghanistan. So it really was a difficult place for journalists. I should say a dangerous place to be journalists. But yeah, so when Taliban returned for the second time in power, I mean, you don't see that anymore. Media is really in a crumbling situation, I should say. There's lots and lots of censorship and no entertainment at all, and no music, unfortunately. Those TV channels and stations that are still on air are really, having a hard time. Every other day you see a horrible news of, journalists being attacked, detained, or abducted. So yeah, it's really a dark time for journalists and journalism in Afghanistan, I should say. Yeah, so the war. The war in Afghanistan really started, according to Afghans, in 2005. I'm talking about when the international community is already present in Afghanistan and backing the Afghan government politically, economically, and militarily. As late as 2005, the Taliban started rearming and resurging, and that's when the international forces are there to keep them away. So the war is not really fought in a conventional manner. It's fought like the Taliban are really resorting on into attacks like hit and run. They resort to bombings, IEDs, ambushes. This goes on until 2014, when the Afghan army is now capable and ready to take responsibilities. So yeah, there were night raids carried out both by foreign forces and as well as Afghan national security forces, which really didn't go well, I think. Again, I want to make this clear that I'm not a military expert, so I don't really know how it was fought, but I think according to what Afghans think, the war didn't really go well. That's why today we are where we are. The Taliban are back in power. So the Afghan army gets the charge and is responsible to keep the Taliban away, but it doesn't go well because they're really dependent on foreign aid, and once that aid is decreased and cut, they're not really able to do anything, and yeah, so just things collapse and fall apart. So may I have the, this is 2021, August 2021, and things already fall apart. The Taliban are already in Kabul. The Afghan government that was, there for like the past 20 years is no more there. It is, yeah, it's a very chaotic situation, and people like myself who had hopes for the future of the country are like in a situation that we don't know what's coming next. Things that was supposed to not happen had happened, and we all are like called to go to the airport. I myself is part of a New York Times evacuation plan. I go to the airport and I spend the night there, and so I'm just trying to show you what was going on inside the airport. Can we have the first clip, please? So I took this video with my iPhone. It's a 12-second video from Kabul airport, and yeah, I'm there with my family, and it goes viral and hits 5.9 million views at the time, and I get lots of requests for interviews, but because I was not in a situation to do that, I just, yeah, so just wanted to show you what was going on inside the airport and what we have gone through. Can we now play another video? The second clip. So he's a mid-level. Can you stop, please? The guy in white clothes is a mid-level Taliban field commander. He is at the airport, outside the airport, trying to convince people not to panic and not to leave. He is trying to tell them that, yes, we are here in Kabul. We have defeated the United States, and don't be afraid of us. So as it gets further, I can translate. He's talking in both in Dari and Pashto. Right now he's talking in Dari. Can we play a little bit more and stop? So he says, no one is as poor as me. I didn't have any money with me, on me. Someone gave me 1,000 Afghanis yesterday, so I had nothing with me. None of you are as poor as I am. So yeah, he's talking about his men, the Taliban, who had not eaten last night and the breakfast, and he says with an empty belly, they were the Taliban were fighting the Americans. He says, they are Afghans and you are also Afghans. I am an Afghan, you are an Afghan. What happened to our pride? He says, what happened to our pride? Today we are holding American slaves and begging them to take us with them. How shameful it is. So it's up to you whether you accept a life of slavery or whatever. Let the Americans live. If they don't, we force them to live. We won't let them stay here any longer. If America gets 10 times as powerful as it is now militarily, we'll fight them, we'll defeat them. A war can be fought with bravery and not, yeah. So yeah, I just want to give you the highlight of what he was saying. He was just saying that the war could only be fought with courage, and he also mentioned his mom. He said in 2008, my mom smuggled me 18 bullets in her headscarf. So how would I let all these weaponaries that we liberated from the Americans and the Afghan army to be sold or given away? There were like rumors that the Taliban are not really capable of holding on those weaponaries and the military equipment that was left behind. So he's trying to reassure people that no, we want to keep that. We want to keep that as something for Afghanistan, and we don't want to give it away to anyone. Because there were also rumors that some of those equipments might be sold or smuggled to Pakistan. So he's just trying to make that clear. Yeah, so this was what was happening outside the airport, and what was happening inside was in the first clip that I showed you. And yeah, so August 2021 was really a time that turned the clock around, and Afghanistan had, witnessed that major change, and things are not really moving well. We have the Taliban in charge of the Afghan government. They have toppled the republic. They have abolished the constitution of Afghanistan. So they're just ruling Afghanistan their way. It's more of, they really don't care about the public and the public's will. They say their legitimacy comes from, divine power, from God. That's why they call themselves the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan instead of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. But and they also call themselves the Taliban 2.0, which is like the new Taliban, the Taliban who had changed. They are not really the Taliban who had ruled Afghanistan the first time they were in power. So they just took power by force. They formed a cabinet, a Taliban-only cabinet. They abolished the women's ministry and replaced it with the Vice and Virtue Ministry that's really doing the job of both the police, the Justice Department, the Attorney General's office, and that's how they are handling governance and ruling in Afghanistan. There are some changes on daily basis, how they react with ordinary people, but it is not really that well. The moral police still exist in some provinces and some places. They really, I should say, force people to do certain things who don't really want to do, which means people are not really happy with that, but that's the Taliban type of, the Taliban way of ruling, and they're really who they are. And I think if we look at who are now in charge, their leader is has not been seen in public in the past 8 months. He is still not in Kabul. They have an interim cabinet which is led by a prime minister or a premier, but the leader is still the number one, who is the supreme leader, sitting somewhere in Kandahar. There are some, rumors that he may not even be alive. He may not, that person may not exist, but that's how, they still have him as the person who is in charge, and they call him the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or leader of the faithful, who is the supreme leader. He issues orders from time to time on certain important things, and that's taken really seriously, and it comes to force immediately. For example, one of the recent decrees that came from his address was about a ban on opium, and it really affected people, farmers, business in the local market in Afghanistan. So they're also trying to consolidate their power and make sure they stay in power. They have been working around, maneuvering around to see that they could get diplomatic recognition in the international arena, but it didn't really go well. So far, no country recognized them diplomatically, but they have, their diplomats in Qatar and Pakistan and a few other places. So these are the things that they are struggling with. As I said, the Taliban are really good at fighting, and in religious affairs, they're not really good people, good in governance and in creating economic plans for Afghanistan. So they don't really have a vision in the sense that Afghanistan should be better off economically. And that, like a couple of months ago, their prime minister had even said this publicly, that we, the Taliban, we, the Islamic Emirate, did not promise economic prosperity and food. We only promised freedom and security, and you have those. So don't expect us to do anything on those terms. That's what their logic is when it comes to economic plans and, for the future of the country. So it's all religious leaders, mullahs leading any portfolios, any ministry, and it's all Taliban only. They don't really allow others who are not Taliban to be part of their leadership council or be in their cabinet, although they have some individuals, but who don't really exercise any. So UN and the NGOs, the United Nations or the UN had a role in coordinating and distributing aid in the past 8 months, which is really good. But it is difficult for the UN to do that without the cooperation of the state, the government. The Taliban not receiving any aid themselves, they don't really pay attention. They don't really like the UN to succeed in distribution of aid. According to UN reports, millions and millions of Afghans are facing starvation. That's because what happened in August last year left about 500,000 Afghans who used to work for the previous government out of salaries and out of jobs. So plus all businesses that were there shut down, and it really created a difficult situation for the people who are in Afghanistan. Plus there is also a drought in Afghanistan that makes life difficult for farmers who relied on harvest. And I already told you about the opium ban. That's when the decree came from their supreme leader 2 weeks ago and was already felt among farmers. There was like a rise in the prices of opium in Afghanistan, in the Afghan market. Afghanistan is still producing more than 80% of drugs around the world. So I also wanted to talk to you about the Haqqanis. I'm sure you have heard about the Haqqani network. It's a terrorist group affiliated with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. These are it's a family. He is the nephew and he is the uncle. He is the leader of the Haqqani network, as well as the deputy of the Taliban supreme leader. Currently, they are both ministers in the Taliban cabinet. The uncle is Minister of Refugees, and Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is also the leader of the Haqqani network, is the Interior Minister in the Afghan Taliban cabinet. He had a role in getting former politicians and leaders to pledge allegiance to the Afghan, to the Taliban government, trying to get politicians to return to Afghanistan and join them and support them. But Sirajuddin is leading the Afghan police. He is the Minister of Interior. I want to tell you about a recent thing that came out of him. Like a week ago, an audio was leaked in the social media from him, and it tells you where their mentality and logic is now. He's apparently talking to a room full of his supporters and telling them about one of his memories from 2018. He was really, leading the suicide bombers and suicide missions in Afghanistan. So he's talking about a case that happened in 2018. So it starts like he says someone brings him the telephone to talk with a suicide bomber who is about to detonate himself at Kabul Intercontinental Hotel. It's at night time, and he says, normally I don't talk on the phone with anyone because of whatever reasons, but the person who brings the phone insists that this is the bomber. His last wish is to talk to you before he's killed. And he says, first I reject that, then for the second time, the guy comes to me and tells me that this guy is going to get martyred in 5 to 10 minutes. Why don't you just have him fulfill his last wish and talk to you? And he says, then I accept that and I get the phone. And when I talk, on the other side of the phone is, he names the bomber, Hafiz Karimullah. And he says, when I get on the phone and talk to him, and he says, Khalifa. Khalifa is a nickname for this guy. And he says, I want to hear what he says. He says, you know what, Khalifa? Prophet Muhammad is now standing here on the door and leading our mission. I've killed so many people here, and my last wish was to be able to talk to you. So I'm going to kill as many as I can, and then hopefully I'll go to Jannah or heaven. So imagine, this is a suicide attack that I personally was covering as a journalist. It's a cold winter 2018. I happened to be the person to cover that for the New York Times. So, I mean, he wants to send the message that Prophet Muhammad, who's the prophet in Islam, is like was on their side and was helping them with all their attacks and whatever they were doing in the past 20 years. And yeah, so again, like right after he became the Minister of Interior, he invited families and relatives of all those bombers who committed suicide under his command, and praised them at the Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul and gave them prizes. And there as well he talked about their bravery and courage and what they had done and how it will be remembered and how best of a service that was in Islam. So in the 21st century, they still have that mentality, and they want people to believe that, yes, Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, had really showed up on that night and helped his men to carry out that mission, which really killed so many innocent Afghan people at that attack. So yeah, it's the Taliban. They're really prosecuting and persecuting former Afghan government employees. The Afghan security forces are really having a hard time. Those who stayed behind and couldn't leave because, it was an army of 350,000. Not every one of them could afford to leave the country. Those who stayed behind are being, persecuted. According to a recent New York Times report, about 500 of them were killed by the Taliban, although the Taliban deny that. So despite declaring amnesty, general amnesty, they are going after people who they think they should kill or detain, and that's what they're doing. Yeah, so they don't have an economic plan for Afghanistan. There is a humanitarian crisis in the country. They go hard on anyone who opposes them, whether it's a nonviolent resistance or criticism against them. They just crack down. A good example of that is when they crack down on women's protests on the streets of Kabul back in January and February. There were some women who wanted them to just give them the right to work and the right to education, just basic demands. All those women who led those protests were abducted and, made sure they don't really show up again. Plus, any armed resistance is being severely responded, and they really can't tolerate anything that goes against them. They just say that we are now in charge, we defeated Americans and the West, we are here. If anyone wants to come and live here, should live by our terms, and this is how we want to rule in Afghanistan. And the reason I chose this photo here is that it shows Afghanistan's empty place in the international arena. In the past 20 years, it wasn't like this. We had our representatives in, international conferences, summits, but it's empty now because who they are, who the Taliban are. It's really, they cannot really convince the international community to allow them and gave them permission to participate as a representative of Afghanistan. And this is very unfortunate. People who had hope for the future of that country are really, it's too much for them. So they've basically turned the country into a mass prison. I managed to escape that prison. Few others did so, but not everyone. The Afghans, the 35 million people who live in that country are still there. They have to just tolerate what's going on. And I think it's totally on to the international community now and the UN to address the crisis that's there in Afghanistan. And if it doesn't, it's going to have dire consequences, there will be a civil war, there will be more crisis, and people will suffer, and I think it's going to be really bad. So I would just stop here, and if you had any questions.
Thank you so much, Jawad. I do want to open it up to questions. I thought I would take the privilege of asking the first question, which is a very difficult question to ask and possibly to answer. You heard much from people within the U.S. government that we couldn't stay there forever. We had to leave at some point, and that, in a sense, that our leaving was inevitable, and that the United States government felt that either the Afghanis and the Afghan army and government needed to get to a point that it could govern itself, or the international community needed to live with the consequences. Do you think that's right? Do you think that the U.S. should have remained, or that it could have remained and averted disaster, or that there was some way that the U.S. could have planned an exit that wouldn't have been such a disaster?
Well, thank you for the question. I think, as you said, it's a hard question to answer, and it gets asked many times from many people, and I don't really think there is a one accurate answer for that. But I think even the exit could have happened in a different way, in a more responsible way. This is what I believe as an Afghan, as a journalist, and as someone who's from that country. Yes, you're right. The United States could not stay there forever, and Afghans really didn't wish that to be like that. But there were ways that things could have been done and managed differently. How about if there was a smooth transition from the Afghan, the times Afghan government to another civilian government, not the Taliban. The deal that was cut between the United States and the U.S. in Doha really, messed up everything, I think, according to most Afghans. This is, that was the turning point. It really discouraged the Afghan government itself from trying to, work on ways and possibilities to do things on its own. That's why it just collapsed before even the withdrawal was completed in August. So I think, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I mean, there wasn't a permanent solution, but it could have been done in a more responsible way if the Afghan peace process worked and there was an agreement on a more inclusive government that the Taliban would also join, would have been, I think, a better solution. And Afghan really hoped for such a thing. Like as late as August, July, August, we were hoping that that's something that's going to happen. There won't be like a Taliban takeover. It will be a Taliban and the rest of Afghan government, like a new government, like a new start, but in a more peaceful transition, not the way it happened in August. It would just took everyone by surprise. So, yeah, I think I've answered your questions. But I know it's hard, yeah.
Thank you so much. Are there other questions in the audience? And then we'll take one from our virtual audience.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. You laid out the history very well. My question is about the bleak future and what you indicated the Taliban mentality about governance is, that they achieved security and they weren't promising a better economic conditions. What is the future? How does that play out in years to come, assuming that there will continue to be limitations on aid to Afghanistan and allowing, the open trade and support that the West is disinclined to do?
Thank you. Well, I should say the reason I said bleak future in my, talk is that's what I mean. I mean the future looks bleak for Afghanistan for so many reasons. I told you about how they are incapable of ruling and offering good governance and welfare. They are only, experts on certain things that, that's, fighting and whatever else that they are after. But yeah, so there is their mentality on how they see women, like girls' education beyond 6th grade is still, there is a ban on that, and there is no one really knows why they don't allow girls to go to school, even though schools are separate. Boys and girls schools are separate in Afghanistan, and there is like a full uniform the women or girls wear at school, and it's not really anything to do with Islam, because there are other Islamic countries that allow girls and women to learn and have education. So yeah. There are things like, the only Taliban government that they want for Afghanistan, the non-inclusivity of government that they have, like non-Taliban, I should say, non-Pashtuns are not really part of the government, which is really marginalizing other, ethnic groups that are living in Afghanistan. Whereas like in the past 20 years, it was more inclusive. We had always representatives of other ethnic groups who were part of the cabinet, who were members of parliament and provincial councils, like, everyone saw themselves in the government. But with the Taliban, it's the Taliban only government, and it's just, they rule the country, I should say, with an iron fist. No opposition, no criticism, nothing even on media. If they find out any sort of news that's not in their interests, they go after the journalist or the person who said that. Social media is being monitored by them. It's really, bleak. It's really dark. That's why I'm not hopeful about the future. And if it continues, there will be more and more, crisis coming up. So I think he has another question.
Here's a question from our virtual audience. To what degree is the Pakistani Taliban involved in Afghanistan?
Thank you. As far as I know, TTP, or the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, is really part of the Afghan Taliban. They don't have a leader, like a supreme leader. The Taliban leader is basically their leader, because since he calls himself Amir al-Mu'mineen, leader of the faithful, that includes the TTP as well. But yeah, their objectives are different. They are really activating in Pakistan and fighting the Pakistani army, and they are against the Pakistan government. But they're not really two different entities, I should say. They're like, it's the Taliban that inspired them. They also call themselves Taliban. Although they have regional leaders, they're not as powerful as the Afghan Taliban. Like in my lecture, I talked about the Afghani network. The Afghani network has the closest relation with the TTP, or Pakistani Taliban. So they really, I think, coordinate and cooperate on many grounds if they can. There was a recent incident, I think it was just last Saturday. The TTP has some refugees along the Afghan border. These are like the dissidents who fled the Pakistani army and came and live on the Afghan-Pakistan border, but in Afghanistan. There was an attack from the TTP on the Pakistani army that killed 7 Pakistan soldiers, and then there was a retaliation on Saturday. Pakistani Air Force carried out airstrikes, killing 47 people. Local officials and locals in that area says that these are all civilians. They're not Taliban. They're not even TTP. But Pakistani, military and government basically says that these are the TTP who are constantly attacking us, and we don't want that. We don't want them to be safe in Afghanistan. So it really caused the tension between the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, and the Pakistani government. There has been, statements, and so that's how they're really, I think they're just one Taliban, except that they have different assignments and missions.
Thanks, Jawad, for the talk. I have a question about, it's very unusual, I think, for an occupying army to come in and then not want to govern in the way that the Taliban doesn't seem to want to govern. So I guess I'm thinking about this bleak future and wondering about where are the sources of opposition within Afghanistan, or perhaps now they're in exile. Is Is it part of the old Afghan government? Are there other ethnic groups? I mean, it seems like the only way out of a bleak future is for some competition for the country, and that seems very absent as you've portrayed it because of the repression. But thinking about the next decade or so, do you see any sources of opposition?
Thank you, Mary. Well, the Taliban even went that far that they have abolished the department that registers political parties at the Ministry of Justice in Kabul. They have done that. So they don't really want to see any opposition, whether it's a political opposition or an armed group or a resistance against them. They don't really want anything against themselves. They just want everyone to, abide by how they want to rule and listen to them and be just part of how they rule. So they don't really want to see any opposition voices. That's on the political side of it. Armed opposition, there are some activities in northern Afghanistan by the non-Pashtun ethnic groups, former politicians and military leaders who are trying to see if they could launch an armed opposition. But because the Taliban are very powerful, it's hard for them to make like a territory for themselves and stand against the Taliban. Otherwise, they're like active, but they're not strong. They don't really pose a challenge to the Taliban because the Taliban have been have just took over and are really powerful. They're fully equipped and have enough men and weaponry, so they just try to keep them like away. So I think if it continues like this, there is a possibility that there might be oppositions against them that will claim territory. It's going to happen, if not soon, maybe later, if they don't change, if the Taliban do not change and do not open their arms towards all Afghans. As I said, women, non-Taliban, they just don't have room for anyone else other than the Taliban. And they have been saying this repeatedly, that if you want to live in Afghanistan, don't expect to join the government. You can just come and live as civilians. We won't let anyone to intervene in politics, and don't expect ministerial jobs. That's their message to the politicians who are in exile. That's how they want to govern, and they don't really are ready to share power with anyone. However, there were like attempts by some political groups and politicians to see if they could like reach on an agreement with them and join them in a way. There are always people who are like easy go. They can, fit themselves in, but the Taliban didn't really take that serious. They just say that now we are in charge and this is how we want to rule, and if it continues, it's going to be,
So there's a follow-up to this question,
Sure,
and then
yeah.
we'll go to our virtual audience.
Okay, just trying to seek out another potential glimmer of hope. It doesn't seem there is such a thing here, but the other angle I'm wondering about is if the West were to soften its stance in terms of being totally opposed to the Taliban and were to offer an olive branch and kind of stipulate or condition it to some easing up of civil rights and, you know, allowance of women to be involved in the government and education and so forth. Do you foresee that as being any potential change that the Taliban, in the face of trying to reverse the economic state of the country, would be willing to accept that?
If I understood your question correctly, well, you know, it's the Taliban. They have their own worldview of Islam. They really want to re-Islamize the Afghan people. For them, if you are not a Taliban, you really weren't following the right path. You need to be corrected. It's their own interpretation of Islam, which is Hanafi school of Islam and Sharia. So they pick Hanafi from now and Sharia from like the old Islamic scriptures. They mix that. It's not written in any form of texture, but that's what they have in their hands, and that's how they want to, you know, implement Islam once again and introduce it to the people of Afghanistan. So the Sharia courts are the courts that they really follow, which is, you know, I think, yes, there are Sharia courts in other Islamic countries, but theirs is different. It's not written, it's their way. It's quick, it's fast, but it cannot be just, and it cannot be practical. I'm not really an expert on that aspect, but I could say that they are really, so into their religious ideology, that they don't see women as, like, you know, they see them as secondary citizens, or that's why it's not really important for them to see women in politics. When you bring that up to them, they're like, well, what's it all about? Why women? Why not? Why women in politics? Why not at home? That's why they justify not allowing women to go to school. So looking in how they see the world and how they, you know, want to see Afghanistan as an Islamic country, their way, their variant of Islam, it means that they are not going to show any soft corners anywhere, and then it won't change, and it will also not have, you know, that the international community won't really have a leverage to come, you know, on an agreement with them. So, yeah, it's hard. As I said, they were a terrorist groups in the past 20 years, and now they're in charge.
Another question from our virtual audience. What do you think about the Taliban and the Chinese foreign ministers meeting? Do you believe that the ban on poppy growth was done to win favor with China? And do you think this will continue to journalistic freedom?
Well, you know, they're really interested in having China's back. They really want Chinese to be involved and help them. But, you know, the Chinese are always, you know, there when there is an economic interest for them. They expect the Chinese to do more, but I don't think China has that goal in mind to be that involved, like to help the Taliban to the extent that they will, you know, give them recognition, although few other states are also waiting for China to be the first country to recognize the Taliban, you know, diplomatic mission, but it hasn't happened yet. Yes, there is a Chinese, you know, Taliban, you know, diplomatic relations, but it hasn't been officially, you know, announced anywhere, and the Taliban are not I mean, so, I mean, China is very careful about what it does in Afghanistan. Yes, it is a neighbor of Afghanistan, but has never been that much involved in other than economic, spheres in Afghanistan. And I think they will stick to that. I don't think they will cross that limit. And what was the last question? The last part of the question?
Do you think this will continue to journalistic freedom?
Is it about Chinese Taliban relations? I mean, I couldn't understand the second part of the question. I mean, there is a Chinese interest in Afghanistan, but it's very limited, and they are still there. And I think it's more to do about minerals and
So the audience member corrected that. So do you think this will harm journalistic freedom? The relationship with China?
I don't know. Journalism is really, not doing well in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Since August last year, about 300 media outlets, both national and international, were shut down in Afghanistan. That tells you all, and this is a report that, came out very recently. The Taliban are not really supporting free media. They only respect media's freedom if it's in their interests. Right now, those media outlets that are in service in Afghanistan, the private ones, like for any media outlet, there is a Taliban representative that's looking on what the services are, and if there is any violations according to them, that journalist or producer or editor will be, warned or detained or abducted, and it just happens. So they really are not in favor of free media in the sense that we understand what free media is. And I don't think, I don't know how this can affect, but the Chinese really are careful about. Has only been a couple of occasions that they did things that drew attention in Afghanistan. So
Another question from our virtual audience. You mentioned the Taliban's moral police. What are their policies? How are they enforced? And because you suggest that the majority of the Afghani population does not share political and moral views with the Taliban, is there dissent between law and its enforcement among the population?
well, the Taliban's moral police is the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. It basically is that ministry that replaced the women's ministry in Kabul. There was a women's ministry department, like a building in Kabul, downtown Kabul. Now that's the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. That's doing the job of moral policing. It really micromanages lives of ordinary people. It tells you what to wear. They go as far as asking taxi drivers and bus drivers not to give women who don't have who are not accompanied by an escort, not to give them a ride. They also go outside the mosques in some places and make sure everyone goes to pray. They encourage people to wear typical Afghan clothes the way they wear. They also ordered government employees to wear beard and not wear Western clothes anymore when they come to work. These are the things that the moral police really does, and it's annoying. It's something that's violating people's privacy. although it's not as harsh as it was when they first were ruling in Afghanistan, but still, they stop people randomly on the streets and check their telephones. If they find music or any entertainment videos on people's phones, they just confiscate the phone and punish the person right at the spot. That's moral policing, and they also make sure in some places that women dress well and wear burqa, although it's not that strict in Kabul, I should say, but that's what they are doing. And their moral police is really, it's the police, it's the judge, it's the attorney right on the spot, and it's the religious mullah, the same guy. So they just whip people on the streets. They punish people by drowning them in the water if they see them not praying at the time of prayer. This happens occasionally and in certain places. I don't say they do it like they used to do last time, but that's what they do. So I hope I've answered that question. Was it just one part?
It was multiple parts, but it does seem like you answered the question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Jawad, do we have any questions from our in-person audience? We probably have time for a couple more. Do we have a question, another question from our virtual
She has.
audience?
Amanda has.
Oh,
one.
I'm sorry. I didn't see you behind the pillar. I apologize.
I think I heard you say, kind of related to some questions asked earlier, that the international community should be one to step in and help resolve the situation. And I was just struggling to understand what would be a way that would be effective given the situation, and like how that any sort of aid would actually be distributed to the citizens. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I hope I've understood your question right. Well, the international community has a duty, a moral duty. When I say international community, I mean the UN, all these agencies, and as well as OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries. They all have duties towards Afghanistan. What's happening in that country is really, alarming. There is a crisis, there is a humanitarian crisis going on, and the way the Taliban are punishing people, persecuting those who had worked with Americans, with a government that was supported by the international community, they're being punished, they're being killed. So yeah, there are ways that they can put pressure on the Taliban government and convince them, to just stop that. And the UN can also pressure the Taliban to allow women to be able to go to work, allow girls to go to school. So these are the things that the international community can do. Just as they were doing in the past 20 years, the amount of aid that Afghanistan was receiving in the past 20 years, like annually, if they do 10% of that, a tenth of that, it will be enough. So these are, there are things that they can do, there are countries that have influence and leverage on Taliban. They can also take initiatives and go ahead and, there will be a catastrophe if it doesn't happen. It's already, there. On the streets of Kabul, you see so many beggars outside bakeries. They're just waiting for subsidies and for bread that's being distributed by UN, by the UN and other aid NGOs. So yeah, there's a lot that the international community can still do, as well as they can, convince the Taliban to open up their arms towards other Afghans, like other politicians, and make their government more inclusive if they want to rule and stay in power. That's the only solution. If these things don't happen, then it will be, the consequences will be dire. So.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and take one more question from our virtual audience.
So this is about the extent of power that the Ministry of Vice and Virtue has. Do they have an extensive police that can also govern rural communities and outside of Kabul?
Can you repeat the question again, please? I missed the last part.
So this is in connection to an earlier question. It's about the extent of power that the Ministry of Vice and Virtue has. Do they have an extensive police that can also govern rural communities and outside of Kabul?
Sure, it does. It has representatives even at in the villages, in the districts. They're known as mustahabs. These people, they just, not all of them have uniforms, but some do. They go to the mosques, they make sure people come to prayers, 5-time prayers, and they also police people on the streets. If anyone trimmed his beard, they just stop him and advise. Sometimes they punish. Depends on where you go. In some places they're harsh. They're like they punish people, and some they're a little bit like easy. They just advise people and tell them not to do those things. They also make sure women do not travel long distances without male skirts. But the way these people exercise, authority is different. Like they decide on everything. They just look at you, they stop you, that means they're the police. And then they tell you certain things, that means, and then they judge on you right away. And they tell you, this is what you have done wrong, and this is what will happen to you. So that's why, you don't really see a limit in their powers, but they're there, and they're both in the villages as well as in the cities. But in the cities, it's not as they're not really. At least for now, they don't punish everyone who wears Western clothes. Whereas in remote districts far away from the capital, they are a little bit more strict. So.
Thank you again, Jawad, for joining us today, and again, sharing what is a very personal story to you. I really appreciate it, and thank you for being here at the University of Michigan with us. Please join me in thanking our distinguished lecturer.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.